The desert wind slapped grit against canvas, as if testing every seam the army owned. Lorries sat in the heat, engines ticking under metal that felt almost too hot to touch, and yet the work went on without theatrics. A Bedford MW, squat and purposeful, rolled across the dust with that unmistakable light 15 Seawatt shuffle, neither glamorous nor fast, but always exactly where it needed to be. Its 72 horsepower engine tugged the little truck forward, even as the sand tried to swallow it whole. It wasn't the prettiest thing the army fielded, but it was the one vehicle crews trusted to appear when rations, ammunition, or hope were in short supply. Even on a bad day, it behaved better than most officers' cars, and so the war leaned heavily on this humble shape, asking far more from it than anyone expected. The British Army walked into the late 1930s with a transport problem so large it could be measured in miles rather than vehicles. Britain still relied heavily on First World War thinking, with its tangle of horses, requisitioned lorries, and odd civilian conversions pressed into military service. When mobilization came in 1939, thousands of units suddenly discovered that their transport tables looked well organized on paper and utterly chaotic on a parade square. The need was more than mechanical, it was doctrinal. An army that intended to move quickly in a modern war could not afford slow, mismatched fleets that strained both supply officers and engines alike. The War Office required a truck that hit a rare sweet spot, light enough to go almost anywhere, strong enough to carry meaningful loads, mechanically simple enough for semi-trained drivers, and reliable enough to survive untidy British weather and the even less tidy battlefields that followed. The army had tried using a patchwork quilt of private lorries, but the experiment worked about as well as sending cavalry to a petrol fight. Standardization was no longer optional. It was survival. A universal 15 Seawatt utility truck, compact, robust, obedient to mass production, became not merely desirable, but urgent. One technical issue stood front and centre: suspension. British roads were rough, rural, and rain-damaged even in peacetime, but France and the Low Countries offered a far more punishing mix of heavy farm tracks, ruts, and shell-torn lanes. Civilian vans simply shook themselves to pieces under military loads. Engineers needed a flexible chassis with semi-elliptic springs capable of swallowing terrain without snapping under overstress. They also needed a wheelbase short enough for agility, but long enough to avoid bucking like an excited mule. Balancing those parameters would become one of the defining engineering decisions of the whole project. The next challenge was fuel. The army expected its new utility truck to run on low-grade wartime petrol that could vary wildly in quality from depot-to-depot engines, had to be tolerant, unfussy, and resolute in their combustion. The War Office evaluated several candidates, but most were vulnerable to pre-ignition or demanded too much from mechanics already drowning in work. What was needed instead was an engine that would start on cold mornings, bear neglect with stoicism, and resist the Army's habit of letting drivers treat handbooks as optional reading material. This would shape the power plant that became the heartbeat of the Bedford MW. Another factor, rarely glamorous but essential, was maintainability. The Army didn't want a vehicle that required specialist fitters or complex tools. They wanted one that an 18-year-old recruit, handed a spanner and a cup of tea, could coax back into life. So Bedford engineers were told to simplify grease points, make access panels generous, and keep electrical systems straightforward. This ethos influenced every bolt and bracket the vehicle might not have dazzled, but it had to sustain an army constantly on the move. Meanwhile, logistics planners projected the scale of movement needed for an expeditionary force in France. Ammunition companies alone required thousands of small trucks to keep the guns fed. Infantry battalions needed dozens more to transport cooks, signallers, medics, spare kit, and the endless tide of urgent stores that seemed to triple whenever an officer drafted a memo. The more the army rehearsed mobilization, the clearer the truth became. A modern fighting force without a backbone of dependable utility, vehicles was a force that would grind to a halt long before meeting the enemy. The Bedford MW emerged from this swirl of needs and constraints not as a showpiece, but as a workhorse engineered to answer a very British problem: how to keep a dispersed, fast-moving army fed, fueled, armed, repaired, and vaguely cheerful while marching through a continent determined to slow it down. It was the sort of vehicle that looked unimpressed by everything, which made it ideal for a war that kept demanding the impossible, and before long its silhouette became as familiar in the British Army as the sound of boots on wet gravel. The vision for the Bedford MW began not with a sketch, but with a doctrine. Mobility was no longer a luxury. The British Army had learned, painfully, that supply columns moved too slowly, command posts took too long to shift, and infantry support relied on a hodgepodge of vehicles that rarely shared parts or temperament. Engineers at Vauxhall Motors, Bedford's parent company, were handed a brief as ambitious as it was maddeningly vague: build something small, strong, standardized, and utterly dependable. A single design, they were told, must serve dozens of roles, from radio truck to water carrier, from anti-aircraft platform to ambulance, and it must do so without demanding an army of mechanics trailing behind it. To achieve that, Bedford's engineers pursued a concept built on three principles: shared components, structural simplicity, and adaptability. The company already produced the civilian Bedford HC and Bedford KC lines, and though these were not suitable for military duty as they stood, they demonstrated how Bedford approached modular construction. Frames, springs, gearboxes, and even cab forms could be repurposed if redesigned for battlefield punishment. This approach allowed Bedford to reduce production time dramatically, which mattered because the War Office initially wanted small batches and suddenly demanded tens of thousands. Doctrinally, the MW needed to bridge the gap between the smaller Morris CS8 and the larger Austin K5. Engineers envisioned a 15-seat truck that could carry men or materials with the same dignity, and that could be transformed by simply altering its body. This approach aligned with the Army's growing belief in vehicle families, clusters of machines that shared engines, axles, and electrical layouts. The MW became one of the earliest and most successful examples of that philosophy in British wartime engineering. At the heart of the concept was the 72-horsepower Bedford 214 cubic-inch inline-six engine. Not powerful in the sporting sense, but deliberately designed with a low compression ratio that let it run on the inconsistent petrol the Army constantly supplied. It was engineered to avoid knocking, tolerate dust ingestion better than rivals, and run even when oil changes were more of a polite suggestion than a regular ritual. The carburettor was tuned for stability rather than finesse, and the ignition system balanced reliability over any desire for performance. This was military pragmatism expressed in cast iron. One structural decision proved pivotal: the slight rearward cab bias. By placing the cab further back on the chassis, engineers achieved a more balanced weight distribution, improving traction on poor surfaces and reducing front axle wear, problems that had plagued earlier light trucks. It made the MW particularly good at manoeuvring across grass, mud, sand and rubble, with far fewer nose-heavy collapses that dogged older designs. It also improved cabin space for drivers who often spent long stretches inside the vehicle, living, sleeping, and sometimes eating in the cab during operations in France and later in North Africa and Italy. Then there was the electrics: 6-volt, simple, rugged, no complexity, no unnecessary resistance points, and minimal wiring runs. It was a vision that matched British Army priorities: keep things running even when conditions were so miserable a textbook electrical system would have given up. Maintenance sergeants appreciated that the MW's wiring was so straightforward that even inexperienced troops could trace faults with a torch and a spare fuse. The MW's evolving concept attracted interest far beyond logistics planners. Infantry battalions quickly recognized the potential for a general service vehicle that could transport sections at short notice. Anti-aircraft gunners saw promise in its chassis strength, which could support light AA weapons without overstressing the frame. Signal units valued the smooth-running engine that created less interference on sensitive equipment. The more Bedford refined its design, the clearer it became that this was not simply a truck, it was a platform for a rapidly modernizing army, but its most defining quality was less mechanical and more philosophical. The MW was designed to be uncomplaining. The war needed a vehicle that moved with purpose regardless of conditions, supplies, or orders. Engineers often joked that the MW had the emotional range of a brick, which is precisely why the Army loved it. What began as a cautious vision soon became one of the most important pieces of British mobility in the Second World War. The build of the Bedford MW was a story of speed, practicality, and an almost obsessive desire to remove anything that complicated wartime manufacturing. Vauxhall's Luton plant became the nerve centre for production, humming with the metallic rhythm of presses, welders, and hurrying boots. Engineers quickly realized that wartime volume wasn't merely about producing more, it depended on producing smarter. With that in mind, the MW was broken down into components that could be manufactured across several facilities and then assembled swiftly at Luton. This decentralized approach allowed Bedford to meet rapidly growing military demand without choking its own production chain. The chassis was the first major assembly, built from pressed steel sections that were strong yet surprisingly light. Bedford opted for a ladder frame with deep side members, enabling the vehicle to withstand uneven loading conditions, common when troops stacked crates, kit bags, and unplanned cargo wherever space appeared. Each frame passed through rigorous jig alignment to ensure torsional consistency. Battlefield conditions frequently introduced twisting forces that warped substandard frames, but the MW's manufacturing tolerances kept distortions low, and handling predictable suspension was built around semi-elliptical leaf springs, individually tempered and tested. Their thickness and curvature were calculated to soak up constant vibration without fracturing, an important detail because MWS often drove long distances at partial loads, a known stress factor for leaf springs. The rear springs, crucial for weight distribution, were set at a rating that allowed the MW to carry more than its official 15 Talbot rating when required, an inevitability on active fronts. The build philosophy quietly accounted for the Army's habit of temporary overloading, a phrase that became permanent. The powertrain assembly line combined the Bedford 214 engine with a 4-speed synchromesh gearbox, a luxury by wartime standards. Many Allied trucks lacked synchronization, forcing drivers to master double clutching under pressure. Bedford believed the Army would fight better if it didn't need a week of driving school just to change gears. Engines were bench-tested after assembly, running through controlled cycles to ensure proper lubrication, cooling, and ignition characteristics. Carburetors were calibrated manually, and although this consumed time, it produced consistency across large batches, extremely valuable for field mechanics. Diagnosing issues hundreds of miles away, cabs were another expression of wartime pragmatism. Bedford designed a pressed steel cab for strength, but paired it with a canvas roof to reduce weight and conserve strategic materials. Workshops riveted panels instead of welding them wherever possible, because riveted repairs could be carried out in field depots with basic tools. The windscreen was deliberately split into 2 panes, reducing the risk of total failure if struck by debris and lowering replacement cost. Such small touches reflected a build philosophy that valued resilience over elegance. One often overlooked aspect of MW production was its electrical standardization. Bedford simplified wiring looms into clearly routed bundles held by metal clips, and each vehicle left the factory with consistent earthing points to reduce the unpredictable faults caused by moisture ingress. Although the MW retained a humble 6-volt system, its reliability stemmed from this uniformity. Field reports noted fewer dead shorts and corroded connections than competing light trucks, a tribute to the engineers who built each loom with real-world abuse in mind. The factory also adapted to shortages with a level of flexibility that bordered on improvisation. When rubber became scarce, alternative compounds were introduced for cab mounts and hose lines. When steel allocations fluctuated, minor alterations reduced waste and shortened stamping cycles. Bedford proved adept at designing around constraints without sacrificing the MW's core reliability. Production figures climbed steadily, and soon convoys of brand new MWs rolled out of Luton bound for training depots across Britain. One of the MW's greatest advantages during production was its modularity. Body variants were fitted onto the same chassis with only minor adjustments. General service bodies, water tankers, wireless trucks, and even fire tenders all stemmed from that consistent underlying frame. This modularity lowered the learning curve for factory workers and kept production moving during periods when specific materials became restricted. If Bedford had found a way to build these things any faster, they would probably have done it while making a cup of tea at the same time. By the time the MW reached peak production, its manufacture had become a finely tuned wartime machine, disciplined, efficient, and surprisingly adaptable. The build process didn't simply produce trucks, it produced confidence that the Army's logistical backbone would hold, even under the heaviest strain. The Bedford MW was tested long before any proving ground gave it an official stamp of approval. Its trials unfolded on the roads, lanes, tracks, river crossings, and miserable gradients that British troops marched over daily. When the first production models reached training units, drivers wasted no time treating them with the sort of enthusiasm that would void any modern warranty. They overloaded them, braked late, cornered sharply, and cheerfully ignored handbooks that explained how not to brake the thing. What mattered was simple. Would the MW survive in the hands of the British Army's newly mobilised recruits who were still deciding which pedal did what? One of the earliest assessments centred on off-road capability. The semi-elliptic springs that engineers had agonised over proved their worth almost immediately. The MW didn't glide over terrain, gliding was for aircraft, but it kept its footing on mud-churned training fields where heavier lorries bogged down its short wheelbase, allowed tight turns in woodland, village courtyards and makeshift command posts, while its ground clearance prevented the underbody from ploughing through every hidden stone. Units reported that the truck handled unexpected terrain variations, a polite military phrase meaning it didn't collapse when the ground suddenly disappeared beneath it. Engine performance came under relentless scrutiny as well. In winter tests, the low-compression Bedford 214 engine demonstrated stubborn reliability. It cranked in the cold with a consistency that surprised veteran mechanics used to coaxing reluctant engines back to life. During heat runs, especially with canvas cabs sealed tight, the engine maintained predictable thermal behaviour. Overheating was always a risk in military service, but the MW's radiator and airflow path proved efficient enough to handle prolonged low-gear climbs, something essential for Italian operations later in the war. Payload trials revealed that the MW was almost always asked to carry more than its rated 15 CWT capacity. Ammunition boxes, fuel cans, tents, tool rolls, rations, and improvised cargo all found their way onto the back. The MW tolerated this abuse with remarkable calm. Only when severely overloaded did handling become twitchy, but the chassis and springs kept integrity even under borderline excessive loads. This resilience made the MW a favourite in infantry companies, who often treated it as a catch-all platform for whatever needed moving quickly. Braking tests were less glamorous but vital. The MW's hydraulic drum brakes delivered dependable stopping power in dry conditions, though performance varied when caked with mud or soaked by rain, common issues in early war France. Still, reports consistently noted that the vehicle stopped in a straight line and that brake fade occurred only after long descents. For wartime use, This was more than acceptable. Field workshops devised simple maintenance routines to ensure brake adjustment remained easy, and this kept accident rates far lower than in many other light military trucks of the period. Driver comfort was also part of testing, even if no one described it that way. Soldiers spent hours in the MW, sometimes sleeping in the cab when orders forced night movements. The vehicle's ride, while firm, was not bone-shaking. The cab layout gave decent visibility, and the split windscreen reduced glare from rising dust. The clutch action was forgiving, the steering predictable, and the gearbox, thanks to its synchromesh design, was unusually cooperative. These traits combined into an experience that made new drivers confident more quickly, a strategic advantage for an army swelling with conscripts. Mechanical endurance trials pushed the MW across chalk tracks, cobbled roads and riverside fords. Electrical looms stayed intact under vibration tests, proving that the neat wiring philosophy truly paid dividends. The chassis resisted twist even when the vehicle traversed cratered ground. After hundreds of miles, inspection teams noted minimal fastener loosening and few oil leaks, rare for light trucks being worked so aggressively. Perhaps the most revealing results came from communication units. Wireless truck variants required low vibration levels to avoid interference on sensitive equipment. The MW's smooth-running six-cylinder engine produced less vibration at idle and under load than many military contemporaries, allowing radio operators to transmit more clearly. This quiet mechanical behavior became a trusted asset in field headquarters and mobile command sections. Field tests did not flatter everything. Of course, the canvas cabs suffered in heavy weather, and waterproofing tests showed leakage points that troops cleverly solved using spare kit, tar, and occasionally whatever they could scrounge from supply depots. But overall, the MW passed its trials with honest competence. In a war full of machines that demanded constant attention, the MW behaved like it would rather get on with the job than have a chat about it. By the time the War Office compiled its test summaries, the conclusion was unambiguous. The Bedford MW was not only ready for the field, it was built for it. The Bedford MW's real examination came not from controlled trials, but from the chaos of war itself. Campaign by campaign, the vehicle was pushed into roles far beyond those envisioned in the design office. It was in France, North Africa, Italy, and later Northwest Europe that the MW delivered its decisive breakthrough, not through any single dramatic moment, but through relentless reliability in thousands of unrecorded journeys. It excelled precisely because it did not specialize. Instead, it became the quiet backbone of movement, supply, and tactical flexibility in every theatre where the British Army fought. In 1940, during the retreat to Dunkirk, the MW's short wheelbase and robust suspension gave it an unexpected advantage. French civilian roads, clogged with refugees and abandoned equipment, forced long detours across fields and ditches. Heavier lorries bogged, slipped, or snapped axles, but MWs frequently found a way through the mess. Troops reported that they could thread an MW through places only a bicycle had rights to, and this agility saved both supplies and lives. The vehicle's ability to reverse quickly, pivot sharply, and traverse narrow lanes proved priceless during rearguard movements. North Africa posed a different trial: sand, heat, and dust that redefined the word hostile. Here, the MW's air filter setup became a decisive factor. Many Allied trucks suffocated in desert storms, but tests showed that the MW's oil bath air filter resisted clogging better than most. This meant its six-cylinder engine kept breathing when others faltered. The cooling system, too, performed with quiet discipline. The vehicle could crawl at low speed for long periods without boiling over, an essential trait when convoys navigated wadis and rock-strewn desert valleys. This steady performance contributed significantly to supply lines that stretched across harsh terrain toward the front at El Alamein. Italy brought rain, mountains, and mud. The MW was pressed into service as everything from troop carrier to improvised ambulance. On serpentine mountain roads, its manageable size allowed it to navigate switchbacks that challenged larger multi-tonners. Infantry companies developed routines around its strengths, using MWs to bring ammunition forward during lulls and evacuate wounded soldiers when stretcher bearers were overwhelmed. The frame showed surprising resilience to constant vibration on uneven stone tracks, holding alignment well even after sustained alpine punishment. As the war moved to northwest Europe after D-Day, the MW found itself in vast logistical operations, supporting the liberation of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Belgian and Dutch roads, often narrow and bordered by drainage ditches, favoured smaller military vehicles. The MW could reach villages, farms, and crossroads inaccessible to larger supply trucks, allowing rapid distribution of food, petrol, and signals equipment. Convoys relied on the MW to handle last-mile logistics, a concept not formally described at the time but executed daily in practice. Failure points did emerge. The canvas cab was a persistent complaint. Cold, wet weather penetrated easily, and the MW offered no creature comforts. Drivers in the Ardennes winter suffered miserable conditions, and makeshift insulation became standard practice. Electrical faults occasionally appeared when moisture infiltrated connections, although these problems were less common than in rival designs. Overloading, though tolerated, shortened suspension life and made brake fade more pronounced on long downhills. Yet even these shortcomings were predictable, manageable, and rarely catastrophic. The most significant breakthrough of the MW was its operational consistency. It did not transform battles or achieve dramatic feats, but it allowed other units to do so, artillery fired, because ammunition arrived. Field kitchens functioned because fuel and rations turned up. Engineers repaired bridges because their tools were driven to the site. The MW was the enabler, the multiplier, the transporter of everything an army needs but seldom celebrates. The Germans, ironically, evaluated captured MWs and rated them favourably. Reports noted the truck's mechanical soundness and forgiving design. Wehrmacht units used them when they could secure spare parts, although British standard electrics limited long-term use. Even so, this grudging admiration underscored the MW's competence across conditions. In the final year of the war, when Allied operations surged deep into Germany, MWs worked ceaselessly to maintain tempo. They ferried wireless operators, sappers, cooks, medics, and entire command posts forward. They towed light trailers, hauled petrol cans, and supported units advancing faster than planners had expected. Some British drivers joked that the MW should have received a campaign medal simply for putting up with them. By war's end, the verdict was unmistakable. The Bedford MW had proven itself not just adequate, but essential. Its minor weaknesses paled beside its strategic value, an unshowy triumph born from engineering clarity and wartime necessity. The Bedford MW's success had consequences the War Office never fully anticipated, effects that stretched beyond logistics charts and vehicle tables. One such consequence emerged from the sheer number of megawatts deployed in multiple theatres. The Army became deeply dependent on a vehicle that was never designed to carry the entire weight of British mobility on its shoulders. When the war broadened and demands multiplied, the MW's role expanded far beyond what planners imagined, revealing an uncomfortable truth about the fragility of wartime supply networks. The first hidden consequence was systemic dependence. Once tens of thousands of megawatts were in service, whole operational plans started to assume their presence. Infantry battalions expected them for routine movement, medical units for evacuations, and signals companies for equipment that technically belonged on more specialized platforms. The MW's reliability encouraged overuse, and this caused strain on spare parts production. Small shortages, fan belts, brake linings, headlamps, could ripple into delays for entire formations. This wasn't a failure of the truck, but an example of how the success of one design can distort broader logistical planning. Another subtle impact came from the MW's role in colonial and overseas postings. Troops serving in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia became accustomed to the MW as a standard of British engineering. A dependable companion in hostile climates, this shaped both morale and expectation. Vehicles define the mood of an army more than commanders realize. A temperamental truck could sap morale faster than a bad rations week. The MW, by contrast, inspired confidence that supply lines would hold. Troops trusted it even in unfamiliar environments, and that psychological stability had measurable operational impact. It fostered a mindset that the army could establish mobility anywhere, whether on desert tracks, jungle clearings, or makeshift island roads. Economically, the MW influenced industrial allocation in ways rarely discussed. Vauxhall's wartime expansion, necessary to meet demand, redirected workers, steel and machining capacity from other British manufacturers. This wasn't simply a matter of producing more vehicles. It reshaped wartime labour distribution across the Midlands. Factories supplying MW components shifted to military contracts, inadvertently starving some civilian industries of parts and skilled hands. The MW became a gravitational centre in Britain's wartime industrial network, quietly reorganising the workforce beneath it. The MW also influenced propaganda without ever being used as a symbol. Wartime newsreels frequently captured MWs in the background, rolling into liberated villages, delivering supplies to advancing units, or ferrying equipment across improvised bridges. Though rarely mentioned by name, the truck became a subconscious visual cue for Allied progress. It appeared in photographs of forward units heading into Normandy, in convoys crossing Italy, and even in Soviet archives documenting Lend-Lease shipments and abandoned German material. Its silhouette became shorthand for British logistical reach. One unintended consequence came from its adaptability. The MW's chassis accepted so many conversions that post-war military planners found themselves dealing with a bewildering mix of variants: fire tenders, mobile workshops, wireless bodies, water carriers, and field ambulances. This diversity, although useful in wartime, complicated post-war demobilization depots had to catalogue, store, sell, or repurpose hundreds of configurations. The very flexibility that had made the MW indispensable in combat added layers of administrative tangle once hostilities ended. There was also a cultural impact. Soldiers who served with MWs often described them with fondness bordering on anthropomorphism. In memoirs and oral histories, the MW is mentioned not as a machine but as a companion, reliable, occasionally stubborn, but always there when needed. This affectionate legacy helped shape how veterans remembered the war, emphasizing the quiet heroism of supporting machines rather than just the grand narratives of tanks and aircraft. Finally, the MW's wartime footprint altered the post-war civilian market. Thousands of surplus MWs were sold into farming, construction, forestry, and small businesses, providing affordable transport in a Britain rebuilding from ruins. This influx accelerated the mechanization of rural communities and small industries. A truck designed for war ended up shaping peace by giving people a tool to rebuild their livelihoods. The MW never asked for recognition, which is probably why it got so much of it from those who relied on it every day. Its hidden consequences were woven into the infrastructure of armies, industries, and post-war recovery, quiet, durable marks left by a machine that never sought attention but earned it all the same. When the guns fell silent and armies shrank back into peacetime shapes, the Bedford MW faced a new world in which its survival was not guaranteed. Many wartime vehicles were scrapped, melted, or abandoned overseas, considered too worn to rehabilitate or too specialized for civilian life. Yet the MW, through a combination of engineering toughness and practical design, achieved a post-war legacy far larger than its modest wartime profile suggested. It transitioned from military necessity to civilian asset with almost suspicious ease. The British Army retained many MWs well into the late 1940s, using them for training, barracks duties, and logistical errands that didn't require newer, more powerful designs. Their simplicity made them ideal for teaching basic vehicle maintenance to recruits. Workshops appreciated how easily damaged components could be replaced or fabricated. Long after newer vehicles arrived, the MW remained the dependable backroom truck of garrisons and depots across Britain, Germany and Malta. These peacetime duties extended its military service far beyond official wartime production. The civilian market, however, is where the MW's legacy truly flourished. Surplus auctions offered thousands of decommissioned units to farmers, builders, hauliers, and small businesses desperate for reliable motor transport. Rural Britain in particular benefited. MWs replaced horse carts on farms, moved timber from small woodlands, hauled potatoes, and even served as makeshift mobile workshops. The truck's light frame and forgiving engine made it a favourite among owners who needed something dependable but couldn't afford new post-war machinery. In Europe, a similar pattern unfolded. Captured or abandoned MWs in France, Belgium, Norway and the Netherlands were repaired, repainted and pressed into civilian service. Some became delivery trucks, others mobile bakeries or repair vans. The truck's adaptability, so essential in war, translated seamlessly into post-war entrepreneurship. Ironically, it became a sort of quiet ambassador of British engineering, valued for the same qualities soldiers had appreciated: reliability, simplicity, and a willingness to suffer rough treatment. Enthusiasts also played a role in preserving the MW. By the 1960s and 1970s, historic military vehicle societies began restoring surviving examples. Their efforts documented and revived interest in light wartime utility vehicles, often overshadowed by larger, more glamorous machines. The MW's relative scarcity compared to its wartime production made each surviving example a small treasure restoration work, revealed just how robustly these trucks had been built. Many were resurrected from barns, hedgerows, or half-collapsed sheds with surprisingly sound chassis and serviceable drivetrains. The engineering lessons of the MW outlived the truck itself. Vehicle designers studying wartime performance identified several principles from the MW that influenced post-war transport philosophy. These included modular chassis design, shared component families, and maintenance-first engineering, ideas that would inform British military trucks well into the 1970s. Even the Army's later standardization efforts owed something to the MW's example, proving that a simple utility truck could anchor an entire fleet strategy if built properly. Commercially, Bedford capitalized on its wartime experience. Post-war Bedford trucks incorporated many of the MW's principles, emphasizing ease of repair and cost-effective production. The company's reputation for rugged, no-nonsense vehicles was shaped directly by its wartime performance. For decades after the war, Bedford remained synonymous with reliable workhorses, a brand identity forged in the dust, mud and chaos of conflict. Aesthetically, the MW became part of Britain's cultural memory of the war. It appeared in films, television series, museum exhibits and reenactments. Its boxy cab, rounded wings and cheerful stance became visual shorthand for wartime Britain. Ordinary men and women doing extraordinary work, supported by machines designed for much more than they were ever credited for. In photographs of liberated towns or advancing columns, the MW often sits quietly behind soldiers, understated yet essential, captured in moments too fleeting to describe, but too important to forget. And perhaps the most enduring part of its legacy is not mechanical at all. The MW became a symbol of modest reliability, the idea that victory often depends not on grand machines or dramatic heroics, but on the hundreds of small tasks completed diligently, day after day. If the war had a supporting cast, the Bedford MW would have received a BAFTA simply for always showing up on time. In the long sweep of history, the MW stands not as a headline act, but as the steady pulse of an army that moved because it could count on its lightest, humblest truck. In the closing reflection on the Bedford MW, we return to a simple question. How did a modest 15 CWT utility truck become one of the quiet pillars of Britain's war effort? The answer lies not in drama or spectacle, but in consistency. The MW was never a machine that sought attention. It was the vehicle that started when it was needed, went where it was told, and carried what mattered. Most of its achievements remain unrecorded. A lantern hanging from its tilt as it rolled into a darkened field kitchen. A wounded man lifted gently into its rear bed. A lone signals operator tapping out messages from its shelter. A crew sharing tea inside its cold cab. These were the moments that built the MW's legacy. The truck's engineering philosophy, practicality over prestige, reflected a broader wartime truth. Britain's strength in the Second World War came from systems that worked reliably rather than spectacularly. The MW embodied that principle. Its chassis, suspension, and engine were designed not for technical marvel, but for tolerance of terrain, of weather, of uneven loads, of inexperienced drivers, and of the relentless wear imposed by long campaigns. In many ways, the MW offered a different definition of performance, measured not in speed or power, but in resilience under pressure. Even as years pass, the MW's silhouette continues to evoke a sense of grounded realism. There is no pretense in its shape, just the lines of a machine built for duty. Restoration workshops that bring surviving examples back to life often comment on how straightforward the truck still is to service bolts loosen, panels lift, engines turn. It is as if the MW's designers anticipated a future where their creation would be cared for by people determined to keep history running. The very simplicity that served the army so well now serves preservationists who view the MW not merely as a machine, but as an artifact of lived experience. The MW also forces a broader reflection on logistics and warfare. Strategy and heroism may fill books, but wars are sustained by movement, the constant unglamorous progression of food, fuel, ammunition, and people. The Bedford MW helped make that movement possible. In photographs of advancing columns or retreating units, the MW is often there, not leading, not following, but keeping pace, integral but unobtrusive. Its presence across so many fronts reminds us that victory often depends less on singular breakthroughs and more on dependable infrastructure. Post-war examples still running today tell a quiet story of longevity. Many have passed through multiple owners, moving from military posts to farms, from farms to collectors, from collectors to shows and rallies. Their continued use echoes the persistence that defined them in wartime. The fact that these trucks, built under pressure and with the materials of an embattled nation, still function decades later is a testament to what careful engineering and practical design can achieve. In the end, the Bedford MW's legacy is neither dramatic nor loud. It is measured in steady miles, solved problems, and the unspoken trust of those who relied on it. If the great machines of the war were orchestras, the MW would be the percussion section, rarely noticed, always essential, and impossible to replace once missing. Its story endures because it reminds us that sometimes the most significant contributions come from the machines that never demanded recognition, yet quietly shaped the rhythm of a world at war.